Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for bearing with us. We're having a few technical difficulties right now, and I will be getting the slides started in a moment. Ken or Scott, which one would like to present the slides?
I can share, that's fine.
Awesome. Ken, I'm going to make you the presenter.
And are you seeing that?
We are seeing your slides.
Great.
Awesome. Okay. As I said, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today. My name is Katie Rowley. I will be the librarian host for the seminar today. As a reminder, as an attendee, you are muted. So everything you need to ask or any questions you have to come through the question panel. And if those questions are of a technical nature about GoToWebinar, most issues are solved by logging off and logging back in. You always have the option to call in as well. We are recording this seminar, so if you do need to step away or if you have to go to another meeting, you want to share this with a colleague, we will have this shared and available, recorded and available for you after the fact. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Monica Grasso, Chief Economist for NOAA, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Katie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. So thank you so much. I'm very, very happy to introduce this webinar to NOAA today. NOAA has always been in the forefront of efforts to understand and value the marine ecosystem services because it addresses especially the relationship between how we use and manage the natural environment and the benefits society can derive from it. So, and also it helps the agency achieve goals, execute priorities such as increasing community resilience, and the sustainable use of the marine environment. On Earth Day this year, Secretary Raimondo and the White House Office of Science Technology Policy, OSTP, announced a new initiative, including a variety of federal agencies, to develop a set of natural capital accounts, incorporating national capital accounts, incorporating those accounts into the national system of accounts, which the national system of accounts is the statistical system that generates economic measures such as the gross domestic product or GDP. NOAA is one of the agencies participating in this initiative. We are currently looking to developing our own strategy to include natural capital accounting into the marine economy satellite account, developed in collaboration with the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Currently, the marine economy satellite account shows how marine and coastal environments contribute to the US economy, but it does not account for specific environmental inputs and ecosystem services that support the economic activities or the manner and degree in which natural capital stocks are consumed or affected by economic activities. So in today's seminar, you'll learn a little bit more about the OSTP initiative with Dr. Eli Fenichel. Eli is the OSTP's Assistant Director for Natural Resource Economics and Accounting. He's currently leading the Natural Capital Account work at OSTP, where he has an appointment while on leave from Yale University. Following Eli's opening statements, we'll hear from Dr. Ken Bagstad and Dr. Scott Wendland on natural capital accounting from pilot accounts to national implementation. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. Dr. Ken Bagstad is a research economist with the US Geological Survey, and since 2016, he has co-led an interagency group developing pilot natural capital accounts in the US. And while at the World Bank, he worked with several foreign governments in the construction of natural capital accounts, and he has assisted the UN Statistics Division in developing natural capital accounting methods and tools. Dr. Scott Wendland is a senior research economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where his research focuses on housing, real estate, land, and environmental valuation. He has worked with Ken on a number of projects related to the interagency working group since 2016, and currently leads BA projects on environmental economic accounts, including land and environmental activity accounts. I want to thank our speakers for accepting our invitation and our attendees for joining us in this exciting event. With no further ado, I yield the floor to Eli.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you all for joining today. It's very exciting to always get to talk about natural capital accounting and environmental economic statistics. NOAA is, of course, a very important partner in this space. The other group leading on this, aside from DOC, is also OMB, and I want to acknowledge their cooperation and help moving all of this forward. I think this is a very important initiative. The question I now get asked is like, how is this going to change things? What's this going to do? And my new canned response is like, I wonder what Simon Kuznets said when people asked him about like this whole like national income and product accounting thing that you're developing. Like, how is that going to be better than counting rail car loadings? And I think certainly we've seen our economic statistical system greatly improve decision making. It certainly has some warts, and it's a practical system and imperfect, which is likely where our natural capital accounting system will land as well. But certainly the ability to harmonize and interact data about the environment and nature with our data on the economy, so we can make decisions that reflect the importance of dependencies on nature for economic production, for income, and prosperity and economic security for Americans is very important. There has been a interagency working group that has been working on a plan to deliver this system. The plan will take us out about 15 years, so we're taking a long-term strategic view to help move the current state of research on natural capital accounting and environmental economic statistics, which NOAA has greatly contributed to, along with many other agencies across the government, and really to moving that research from research to core statistical products where they are reliably and regularly produced in a way that the American public can count on them. Trying to think, Scott, Ken, did I miss anything important here? That it's a phased plan, and so we do expect for products to start becoming available in the relatively near term, but wanted to have a long-term strategy to really move the whole process forward. And I will ask Ken or Scott if they think I forgot anything important that I should be mentioning to this group.
Well, maybe one other quick thing, Eli, is that we've been giving some of these introductory talks to some other parts of the federal government, to EPA, to USDA, and now to NOAA. And we recognize this is inherently an interagency exercise. And so building the awareness of the efforts and understanding how what NOAA does can contribute to it and how it can improve our larger set of information and statistics provided by the entire federal system is very important. So I know we're all excited to be here today to help do that. Yeah,
that's an excellent point, Ken. the last time I counted, we had over 14 agencies engaged in the interagency working group that spanned really what the U.S. government does, from places like Bureau of Labor Statistics to NOAA to USGS to USDA to EPA and Treasury and all over the place. And so that is very important. And the Chief Statistician of the United States is also very engaged. And there have been a lot of changes to the statistical system over the last few years that are really making this all possible from an authority standpoint, but it is up to all of us to make it possible in reality, given the importance of the interagency cooperation needed to pull this off in the United States. So that's a great point, Ken. So I will be quiet and let the two technical experts here actually get into the what I find interesting stuff of all of this.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Monica and Eli. I'm going to start us off by talking a bit about this piloting efforts that began, and then we'll move into the more recent OSTP-led efforts. This work has been going on internationally, I should say, for over a decade, and the US efforts really started to pick up steam around 2016. A group of us technical experts from across the government were able to get together, get some funding from some various sources to start pulling ourselves together, along with a few international experts, a few key experts from academia. And over a 5 or so year period, we produced a special issue in the journal Ecosystem Services on natural capital accounting in the US and also in Europe. We did some of this in partnership with some colleagues in Europe, where there's a bit longer history of natural capital accounting. And one of the points that I just made and that Eli reemphasized is this need for coordination across government. And we see in this figure the fact that there's quite a lot of agencies involved, and this certainly isn't even all of them, but it involves the US statistical system, which is about 13 different agencies, a number of non-statistical agencies who still play a key role, some of whom are highlighted here. And then we provide information that can hopefully help to advance the work of a number of different federal agencies, state and local governments, the private sector, NGOs, and to shape discussion around economic development and the environment within academia, the media, policy, and society. So this is really the big picture for where I hope this is going in the years ahead. I'll open us up by talking a bit about what natural capital accounting is and how it fits together with the system of environmental economic accounting, where the US fits into all of this. And then Scott and I are going to tag team a description of some of the work done to date, as well as where things are going in the future. So I'd like to open us up by talking about these international standards. And international standards are, of course, important because if every country in the world was doing this differently, we wouldn't have a very good picture of where the international economy sits, of where the interaction between national economies. That international comparability is extremely important. And as such, there's a portion of the United Nations, the UN Statistical Commission and UN Statistics Division, who has for years worked on a system of national accounts, the most recent being from 2008, and there's actually a new revision of that planned for 2025. But the system of national accounts is intended to track economic activity, and it's been in place since the early 50s in a number of different iterations. As Eli said, it has its limitations, but it's provided an important standard for the world's governments to measure and compare their economies and how those have evolved over the years. We've known, however, since the beginning, really, that that system of national accounts doesn't properly treat critical inputs like natural resources and ecosystems. And in response to that, in 2012, there was the release of a statistical standard called the SEA, or System of Environmental Economic Accounting Central Framework. And more recently, in 2021, the approval of another statistical approach called sea ecosystem accounting. And the goal here is to track natural resources over time across spatial scales, and to do so in a way that it will be comparable with our national economic accounts, which brings a whole variety of benefits for environmental economic decision making. So the central framework, as I mentioned, was produced in 2012. It describes and tracks environmental flows, stocks of environmental assets, things like energy and minerals, water, land, agriculture, fisheries, and forestry, as well as economic activity related to the environment. And so we have here a view of the economy contained within the environment and drawing on natural resources, having a number of relationships within the economy as goods and services are produced in exchange between different actors in the economy, and then the return of what are termed residuals back to the environment, waste products and return flows of water and other materials back into the environment. So SEA includes physical flows of energy, water, materials, air emissions, solid waste, and other components. It includes environmental activities, which are undertaken by government, which Scott's going to describe in a bit more detail later. It also describes the assets or the volume of environmental goods and resources that are present in the economy. And we'll talk a little bit about both land accounts, which Scott has done, has led work on, water accounts I've been involved with, and there are a number of others that will be developed as part of this OSTP-led plan as well. As I mentioned, this is all done within an accounting structure that's consistent with the economic accounts. The boundaries look a little bit different, but the accounting principles and the valuation methods are intended to be the same. And these have a wide variety of uses across policy, research, NGOs, the private sector. As one example of that, the International Monetary Fund uses a climate change dashboard, and there are a number of other of these sort of international comparisons that are being produced and used by international organizations. But we see here the U.S. actually missing in this iteration of the climate dashboard. And so countries all over the world have been doing this. And the US is a little bit late to the game, but one of the objectives with this new effort is for us to rapidly catch up. And we have all the ingredients to do that. We should be able to be successful at that if we can put together a sound effort, which I think we're really starting to do. I mentioned increasing global use of SEA. This is from an article, this map's from an article that's 2 years old, and it's already in many ways dated. There are many countries, and a recent survey by the UN tallied about 90 countries that are either already compiling accounts or are in the process of starting that. So there's actually quite a bit of the world map is covered by those 90 countries. We have the SEA central framework that I mentioned. There's also SEA ecosystem accounting, and the biophysical parts of ecosystem accounting were approved as an international standard in March of 2021. At the same time, there was a recognition that we need to move further on monetary valuation to have the consistent national scale approaches that are compatible with our economic accounts. And so more work is needed on monetary valuation. The ecosystem accounting standard, which I just mentioned, is designed to give a complete and coherent view of ecosystems, of their extent, condition, the services they provide in both physical and monetary terms, and both as flows, annual production of those services and the value they provide to the economy, and as stocks or assets that are valued. And of interest to NOAA, this of course includes not just terrestrial, but coastal and ocean systems too. And there's quite a bit of work which some of the leaders at NOAA have been undertaking in how to think about and develop accounts for coastal and ocean systems. So the UN Secretary General on the passage of SEA ecosystem accounting as an international standard made the remarks that This is a historic step forward, and one of the things that this will do is no longer allow environmental destruction to be considered economic progress. And when we only track part of the economy in the existing national accounts and we don't account for the contribution to natural resources and the cost of their depletion, then we have an incomplete measure that can fail us and can allow destruction to be considered progress. So these new measures are really critical for giving us that holistic view. The work that we've been developing in pilot accounts for the last 6 years includes work on land, which Scott is going to talk about. It includes work on water that I'll describe, work on ecosystem accounts, which I'll describe as well, and work on some other types of accounts. Scott will describe one or two of those, and really these are intended to evolve, as Eli said, over the next 10 to 15 years into a comprehensive set of accounts that are going to provide a really rich view of the connection between the economy and the environment in the United States. And so in order to do this, both for our pilot accounts and for the emerging national accounts, we want these to be publicly available on a national scale. Ideally, we want these to be geographic. This differs by account, but spatial data is very important for many of the accounts, especially ecosystem accounts. We want to be able to update these over time. One of the key reasons that GDP and the other national economic accounts are so powerful is that we can look back over decades and we can see how they change in response to world events and in response to policy choices that have been made in the US, and so they help to guide future policy choices. And we hope to use open tools and methods wherever we can. So to get into a description of what some of these pilot accounts look like, Scott's going to talk a bit about land, environmental activity, and air emissions accounts, and then we'll flip back to me to discuss water accounts, ecosystem services, and lessons learned in future efforts. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Scott to get us started on land accounting.
All right, thanks, Ken. Now, Ken, do you want to hold on to the slides and advance them, or do you? I could share screen.
I'm happy to advance if you want to say next slide, or do you want to share? I can go either way.
Sure, you can. I'll let you advance. So I'll just say next slide.
Okay.
Next slide.
So
we're gonna hand it back to you in a little bit. Okay, so as Eli and Ken mentioned, that most people are aware of the national income product accounts, in particular GDP. A headline number comes out last week, in fact, and everybody's talking about it. And so there's a lot of awareness about the economic accounts, which excuse me, which largely focus on production. The product side of GDP is where the BEA tends to focus, and many of the economic accounts tend to focus. But if you sort of squint, you may find various aspects of the environment or particular aspects of the environment, like land, within some of these accounts already, either as insofar as some of these assets like land require rent paid on them as part of spending, or it is an intermediate input or component of the final good or service. But then at that point you're really sort of squinting. You don't really have a good idea of what land is worth as an asset, or a good way of keeping track of it, making what, as Ken mentioned, the accounts incomplete. But if we look elsewhere in the accounts, so next slide. We do find that the BEA not only tracks production, but we track things that have been produced or other assets, things like consumer durables, structures, and capital equipment. But like land, like a lot of other environmental assets, are non-produced assets, and so they wouldn't be in this set of the asset accounts that the BEA produces. Next slide. So one next place there you might find these, and actually, according to the last SNA, we should find land on the value of land on the United States balance sheet is part of the integrated macro accounts. Next slide, Ken. But if we look closely, a lot of countries, including the US, don't actually include land on their balance sheets, or at least the full value of land. In some cases, there might be some aspects of land that countries quantify, but not necessarily the whole thing. This has been sort of one of the a lower priority for many countries, including the US, to have a complete accounting of tearing out sort of separating the value of land from other real estate and separating that out from structures and so forth. So next slide. So one of the things that this SEA Central framework had done about 15 years ago, or at least started this work, and then ultimately passing it as a standard about 10 years ago, is start to think about land and other environmental assets as part of a set of satellite accounts that countries would produce that would be these non-produced, non-financial assets, essentially. And one of the areas that sort of crosses both the SNA standards and as well as the environment is land. And so this can be found actually in both SNA and the SEA Central Framework. But SEA Central Framework has you know, some caveats and expansions of the definition that of the land account that would include not only quantifying in detail the land value as an asset, but also aspects of land cover and land use in detail. So this is one of the examples in the manual itself, what one of these tables might look like. Next slide. So one of the things that we had done with a group of researchers within the US, that on a paper that I had led in a special issue on natural capital accounts in the US and in the European Union, was a paper that tried to quantify land accounts in the United States as a pilot research effort to quantify both the physical and monetary aspects of land in the United States, using detailed data sets that already exist for the US. Ken mentioned that in some of these, there's a number of other countries that are producing data for environmental economic accounts, and the US is a step behind, but not necessarily on the data side. And one of the things that we tried to show in this article and in other articles, that the US actually has right now a lot of data that could get us quite a ways there towards producing these sorts of accounts. And we demonstrated this with our pilot land account using both data from USGS and other private sources like public sources as well as private sources. We had data from big data from Zillow and one of their big data sets, so to speak. And we had quantified both land cover, land use, and land value, estimating the contiguous 48 states being worth about $25 trillion. We're trying to value not only residential land, but also agricultural land, commercial land, and industrial land as well. Notably, in this particular paper, we're not quantifying public lands, but we leave that for another project. But mainly, one of the things that this project and other projects have done, before I get into some more of the results, more of what we had done just really briefly, is that we document gaps in the existing US data in order to understand what more needs to be done within the US statistical system or the US government more broadly in order to fill some of those gaps, so that, you know, in the years ahead, we might be able to produce accounts that are, you know, worthy of the international standards and could actually sort of be leaders in the world on many of this, both methodologically as well as the data itself. Next slide. So, you know, we have, I'll talk about a few examples in the paper itself, but some of the things that we had done is, you know, we've taken a detailed look at both land cover and land use, where we're quantifying it in various categories that are useful both economically and environmentally. Next slide. And by doing this, especially if we do it in consistent time periods, and we just showed a couple time periods to show how land cover evolves over time. And that's one of the sort of key aspects for these accounts, is to be able to track environmental assets or our environmental economic assets over time. And so we showed some examples of what's going on in land cover, but in a way that is, sorry about that, in a way that is consistent with how other countries also track these accounts. Next slide. But maybe one of the most novel things that we have done, so a lot of this land cover data and land use data already exists in other places that you might be able to find and put together, but we also link it to data so that we can quantify the value of land. We, in particular, we use a hedonic approach to value land from residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural lands. And we estimate that by, we estimate the value of that using millions of observations of sales data and detailed property characteristics to make very fine estimates, both aggregating in this particular slide, even though it might be a little bit hard to read, both you can see by type at regional level over periods of time. And Ken, if you go to the next slide. We also can link it even much finer. So if we wanted to, you can look at this at the, in this case, we looked at land value at the census tract, and you can make some of these linkages between land cover and land use in ways that you can learn a lot more about this kind of data when it's harmonized in a way that's consistent with these accounts. And we talk about that more in the paper. Next slide. Another project that is sort of in the works right now, but maybe something that NOAA folks are familiar with, is a version of a satellite account. I'll talk more about some of our other satellite accounts that, again, NOAA is already involved with. But we are in the process of doing research to explore the feasibility of creating an environmental activity account, which quantifies, in this case, something that is within the boundary of the SNA and normal economic activity, but is economic activity that's related to environment and environmental preservation and management. We've had some efforts in the US over the past decades that have done things like this. So BLS's Green Jobs Initiative had classified green goods and services and green technologies and practices. The Economic Statistics Administration has wrote a detailed report on this in 2010. There have been some other efforts by Census, EPA, and ITA and others in the past related to this as well, but mostly as sort of one-time efforts and nothing that would really span any length of time. And so next slide. And so what we want to look to do is we want to see, well, given our current data, what is it feasible to create additional satellite accounts that would shed light on broader aspects of the economy that are related to the environment, which would have the same flavor as some of these more specific satellite accounts. One, of course, being the marine economy account, which NOAA has been intimately involved with, as well as the outdoor recreation account that track these particular parts of the economy. But the environmental activities account would be quite a bit broader, but basically having the same general approach. Next slide. So by broader, I mean that this set of accounts not only would track what we call environmental goods and services, and we don't have enough time to go into all of the details of what qualifies as environmental goods and services, but basically looking at the expenditure side of the economy and the supply and demand side of the economy by looking at both environmental goods and services accounts and the environmental protection expenditure accounts. As well as the public side of the economy. So not only as a subset of environmental protection expenditure, we will have breakout public expenditure specifically, as well as environmental taxes and subsidies, which are also an important part of any modern economy around the US. It has been less so in the US versus over in Europe, but these are increasingly policies that matter over time in the age of global warming concerns and so forth. So the research underway that we have currently on this is going to develop a pilot account, just like we had done with the land accounts and the accounts that Ken's also going to talk about in just a minute. But before I hand it back to Ken, I just want to talk about one more account, which is the air emissions account. So next slide. And this is also a pilot effort that is trying to quantify the physical flow air emissions and the supply use side of air emissions, and linking it directly to the supply and use tables and economic activity in the accounts. This is a collaboration with the EPA and other partners that I'm not the lead on this particular one, so I'll talk less about this one. But this is also an exciting project that we have planned that is due out in March of 2023. So I'll hand it over to Ken. That's all I've got for now.
Thanks, Scott. I'm going to move us along to talk a little bit about a water account that we built for the US as one of our pilot accounts. And water is actually one of the oldest of the accounts that was developed. The framework for it was published in 2007. And like the other CS Central Framework accounts, it measures the asset itself, the flows between the environment and economy, and valuation where possible. And this itself doesn't have such a spatial element. It can be summarized by states, watersheds, or other geographic units, but this excludes the ecosystem services related to water, which are covered in C ecosystem accounting, and I'll hit on just after the water account. So we know, of course, that there are flows of water through the natural system as part of the water cycle, and as water is uptaken by various human systems and infrastructure, cycles through the economy and its use and is released back to the environment. And so CO Water intends to quantify as much of this as it can. Our pilot account used water use data from USGS, which has been produced every 5 years since 1950 and is undergoing a major modernization right now. By the end of this year, some of the first data are going to be produced on an annual basis that will go back to the year 2000 and will have quite a bit better accuracy and reliability and frequency of production. We combine that with BEA GDP data to get a measure of water productivity, how much economic bang for the buck we're getting from a particular unit of water. And we use water quality data from USGS and others to look at how water quality is changing, and data from EPA to look at emissions to water by industry. So as before, like Scott showed, we can produce state level summaries. Some examples here of water productivity and its changes in water use over time, which has generally been, we've been using water more efficiently in most parts of the country, and how much of that's coming from groundwater. So getting at, in some cases, the sustainability of water use. And there are a number of different uses we can have for this information. We produce accounting tables similarly to how Scott had shown, and one of the things that's consistent here is that we're trying to disaggregate as best we can across the US economy, how water is used, how that changes over time, and how it flows between the different water users, from industries that pull in water themselves to public supply systems that supply water to other economic units, and then the return of water back to the environment. All things that are tracked in these accounts. And also things like water emissions, in this case, the emissions of 5 major categories of water pollutants by about a dozen or so major US industries. We can, of course, graphically display this. This is for the US, but this could be done at any geographic level for which we have the data, looking at where the water is coming in from the environment, how water is being returned to the environment, and how it's cycling through the economy. So this is one sort of graphical view that we can develop. And we did an expert elicitation, which provides us a first look at how water quality impacts water use. And so not just on one side, you have what different water users depend on water of a certain quality. Different water users also have impacts on water quality, and understanding those trade-offs is going to be critical as we move to next generation water accounts and as we manage our water more smartly in the era of climate change. I'll pivot to talk a bit about ecosystem accounts, having covered land, water, and some of the other central framework accounts between Scott and myself. Ecosystem accounts are mainly looking at the extent and condition of ecosystems and the services they provide. And so we have some examples here of how we can measure, for example, recreational birding and air quality's influence on human health, and also how trees, for instance, can help to filter and improve the quality of air and have benefits for human health. So we compiled an ecosystem account for the southeastern US as one of our pilot accounts. This shows a 10-state region that we did this pilot for, as well as some of the metrics on the right and the table that shows which types of ecosystems, in this case land cover, whether they're being provided by water, urban areas, forests, wetlands, or other natural ecosystems, for metrics like pollination, water purification, bird biodiversity, and bird watching, air purification, and carbon storage was another one that this study addressed. So how those are changing over time, in this case from about 2001 to 2011, and these accounts are being updated as we speak up to the year 2019 for the southeastern US. This can support with that spatial data. We can re-aggregate it to different scales, and we did a little example for the Atlanta metropolitan statistical area, since that's one of the fastest growing areas within that 10-state region. And we looked, for instance, at how urbanization is changing the ability of ecosystems to purify water. We can also pair that with a variety of other data from land, water, ecosystem accounts, and our economic accounts and population to get a really comprehensive picture of how the economy and environment are changing in fast-growing areas like Atlanta, although these summaries can be produced for other places where we have the accounts too. So they give us the ability to look at some of these linked trends wherever we develop these data. And as another example of the type of accounts we can produce, we did a little bit of work for Department of the Interior and other federal agencies in North Carolina, looking at some of the ecosystem services that are produced by federal lands, in this case, Department of the Interior, and how are those changing over time for different national parks and national wildlife refuges. What are some of the key services provided by each of these units of federal land? And what's the percentage of the state total that federal lands are producing? In this case, DOI lands are just over 2% of the total land area of North Carolina. In the West, they're of course much bigger. But one of the things that's interesting is they provide an outsized amount of some of the ecosystem services, in particular things like coastal flood protection. When we have a lot of national seashores and wildlife refuges along the coast, a huge percentage of that is produced by Department of the Interior lands, and also terrestrial and blue carbon storage, quite a bit produced by Interior lands. And again, having those accounts, we can summarize them. In this case, we did this for Interior, but we can produce them for any other federal agency that manages lands and waters as well. I'll spend a moment talking about urban ecosystem accounts, which were another one of the pilot accounts we developed. And we started off by developing accounts for rainfall interception and heat mitigation for every US city with a population of over 50,000. And again, we developed these accounts for the years 2011 and 2016. We parsed them out by the types of ecosystems providing the service and the types of economic units benefiting. And for heat mitigation, that's mostly households, but not entirely. There are other industries that benefit as well. And for avoided water runoff. That's primarily benefiting the wastewater treatment sector, but we can measure that again in physical and monetary terms. This gives us a view of the relative value across over 700 US cities in terms of energy savings from cooling, and the amount of rainfall interception and where that's benefiting cities with and without combined sewer outfall systems, so with some slightly different impacts on their water quality. And we're in the process of developing national scale crop pollination accounts, which are going to provide a view of how habitats surrounding crop fields provide the pollinator habitat and populations that are needed to pollinate many of the nation's diverse and high value crops. So we're working on that right now, an account that will cover a 12 or 13-year period in physical and monetary terms. And with many of these, we're trying to build the infrastructure, the programs, and the model code that will allow these to be recompiled year after year using high performance computing. The last thing we produced was a lessons learned paper, and I'll focus on 3 of the key lessons learned. One is the need for coordination, which we've already highlighted. There's a need for coordination, and Scott and I, coming from very different parts of the US government, have been collaborating together now for a number of years, along with a very large group of other partners. Eli, in his role at OSTP, has been helping to assemble yet more agency partners into developing a coherent strategy for natural capital accounting in the US. We know that we need to develop demand for this information, and that if the information is produced on a regular basis, or if it's used and demanded by the public sector, the private sector, and others, then it will be produced. If there's no demand for it, it's going to be harder to justify the production of these accounts. So we need to cultivate the demand and the use for this information. And we highlighted some technical paths forward to move from the sort of experimental or pilot accounts that Scott and I have talked about today towards eventually 10 to 15 years down the road, and sooner for some accounts, production grade accounts that are produced on an annual basis and with a high level of trust and confidence that the rest of the US statistical system entails. I'm going to spend just a few more moments to wrap us up, and I won't spend much time on this slide because Eli really hit on this, but again, the announcement made on Earth Day that the US government is going to be developing a strategy and starting to produce these accounts. Very exciting news, and what's really helped us intensify our efforts over the summer and going forward on an interagency strategy and implementation. And I'll close by talking about NOAA's role specifically, and this is a chart describing some of the accounts that are planned for compilation, including both the headline summary indicators, so the equivalent to the GDP metric that would summarize some of the natural capital accounting information, a number of satellite accounts themselves, and accounts that will be developed in phases, with the phase 1 accounts coming first. And all of these pretty much require collaboration across multiple parts of US government, but the ones I've highlighted here are ones that NOAA will play either a lead or a very central role on. So you can see that there's heavy need for NOAA participation and awareness around these accounts. And as well as some phase 2 and 3 accounts that will come a little bit further out, but are still going to be important, and some various supporting activities that NOAA will play a key role in. So NOAA is a really important partner in all this, and we're excited, as we said, to participate today and help raise awareness about this. So that's it. This is our final slide, and I just want to say that in addition to any questions you may have for Scott, Eli, and myself, which we're happy to field, we're more than happy to talk about NOAA's specific interests and priorities in natural capital accounting. How can this better support the work that NOAA does on the user side? And on the production side, how can NOAA help to produce these? Which offices of NOAA might be key players? And I have a feeling there's a number of them. You within the programs will know better, of course. And how can existing research within NOAA help support natural capital accounting, especially as we talk about coastal and ocean accounts, which we've really only mentioned on the fringes, but we know NOAA is going to be a key player for. So with that, I'll end my part of the talk, and we welcome your participation in this initiative and are happy to answer any questions or any discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Ken and Scott. This has been enlightening. So I have a question for Scott first. For the air emissions account, could you please talk a little bit more about what it means to be outside the scope of the SEEA? Is this because of methodological differences within the SEEA framework, or because of the limitations in covering air emissions?
So, so maybe I was a bit too glib in part of that. I should have qualified that, say that part of the work that is being planned is outside of the scope of the SEEA. What the BEA intends to do is within the scope, and the scope is that the SEA includes an account for quantifying physical flows of air emissions, but it doesn't have a monetary valuation of those flows. And there have been a number of proposals throughout, actually for decades, about valuing air emissions and making some sort of adjustment to the sort of the bottom line numbers within GDP based on that valuation. And so there's various green GDP kind of proposals that haven't, for a variety of reasons, including a number of methodological disagreements on how to value air emissions, that hasn't become part of the statistical standard. But what is part of the statistical standard for air flows is the tracking the physical quantities of air emissions. And this is also somewhat consistent with the recent ecosystem services accounting manual that as the statistical standard, some of those assets are it's recommended that we track the physical quantities, but the valuation is more preliminary and experimental at this point. And so there aren't, for at least some of the ecosystem services accounts, there are no internationally agreed upon valuation standards, or at least as a statistical standard. So that's the sort of the caveat there. It is within the SEA, but only part of it.
Thanks so much, Scott. Our next question, could you both, either one of you, speak more about how you're assigning values to ecosystem services such as CO2 removal by seaweeds, forests, etc., and a similar question regarding services such as shoreline protection from healthy reefs?
Well, I would say that first of all, anyone who's familiar with environmental economics and non-market valuation probably recognizes the challenges in doing it. And there are, of course, a variety of methods to do that, ranging from social cost of carbon to avoided damage methods. And we need to be careful when we're doing that, first of all, we're using methods that are consistent with the system of national accounts. For the economists in the audience, the system of national accounts is typically measuring exchange value, the value of goods or services bought and sold, and not consumer surplus. So that is a bit different lens than the sort of standard welfare economic lens, which considers consumer surplus as well. And we need to have methods that are scalable to the nation. And those, I think, are two of the big challenges around valuation that were highlighted when the ecosystem accounting manual went up for review last year, and the decision was made to not to elevate the valuation part to a statistical standard. Eli and Scott, I'm sure you have more to say about that.
Yeah, just to add on, I think when we talk about valuation from the national accounts side of it, sometimes we aren't as clear that, especially when we're talking about to other environmental economists who look at sort of broader definitions of value, which, as Ken mentioned, include not only like the producer side, but the consumer side, consumer surplus in particular, that some of that value is, or at least all of the consumer surplus value is not in our other economic accounts. And so therefore, we have to be very careful to not include those, not because that they're not worthy of being measured, but if we have one set of accounts that is valuing sort of these products in this broader way, which includes both its supply or this producer surplus value and producer value, as well as exchange value, as well as consumer surplus value. But then you only have the exchange value of, let's say, healthcare or education or any number of other activities which also have a huge amount of consumer surplus to them as well, but we're not measuring that in the national accounts. That you get this comparability problem with the accounts, and that was one of the sort of big debates, that if we're going to produce these types of accounts, we may have to narrow the scope of the valuation so that it's more you're dealing with comparable values, and that's been where a lot of the debate has been for these statistical standards. So I think the examples that you'd mentioned are good examples of where a lot of the value may be sort of on the consumer surplus side, but its exchange value might be low, or maybe not low, but maybe it's also very fundamentally difficult to value as well. So even those are another reason why it may not have, those services may not have a statistical standard associated with them.
Thank you both. Another question. Can you talk about the demand for accounts that have already passed the research phase in the US? Can you mention the types of groups that use the information provided from the accounts and how they're using it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just briefly mention, these aren't SIA-based accounts, but our satellite accounts I mentioned earlier that have been developed in recent years. Not only the marine economy, which we partnered with NOAA on, but also the outdoor recreation accounts that we've received enormous positive feedback from users, both within government, within academia, within private sector, on they've been very useful in a variety of contexts. And I think, as Eli mentioned at the top of this, I think we would just be hitting the tip of the iceberg, with understanding what all the possible uses of these accounts are, just by some of our anecdotal evidence, because over time, I think that these have the potential, just like the economic accounts, to reach a lot of places that we couldn't currently imagine.
And anything from you?
Well, I just add, it's early in the game, certainly, and all of these accounts that we had, that Scott and I gave overviews of, were developed 2020 and 2021, so they have not had a lot of time to be out there in the public eye or in use of the agencies. I'll speak from the perspective of Interior and saying that we're doing quite a bit of outreach with our policy shop and some of the other offices in Interior to understand the uses for decision making at Interior, and there are certainly parallels to NOAA in managing coastal and ocean resources. So I think there will be lessons learned across the agencies that have responsibilities for actually managing natural resources, like DOI and NOAA, as well as others. The other thing I'll mention is there's been work as well by some of the non-governmental partners in this effort, and one of our colleagues at the University of Hawaii, Kirsten Olson, has been working on water accounts and coastal and ocean accounts for the state of Hawaii, and working with the Hawaiian government on that. And while I don't have precise examples of the policy uses there, I'd certainly encourage you to look her up and reach out to her. In particular, she has a Pew grant to do coastal accounting in Hawaii, which could be instructive for future work in ocean and coastal zones.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks, Scott. We don't have a question, but we do have a comment. In the interest of maintaining consistency in your geospatial data sets for change analysis over time, we'd like to note that NOAA will be modernizing the National Spatial Reference System in 2025 which means that all latitudes, longitudes, and heights will change, and this will likely affect your array of geospatial data sets in different ways, some more impactful than others, that you should be aware of the impacts and changes. Not a question, but a good note to remember.
Yeah, thank you, certainly. And I appreciate that very much. Coming from USGS as another part of the federal government, NOAA's got a key role in geospatial data to play.
All right. We do have another question. Someone arrived late and is asking, is there consensus with valuation of ecosystem services?
No, and that was, I think, something I mentioned earlier, that the most recent manual for accounting manual for ecosystem services has chapters on valuation and guidance for valuation, but those are not, those are still at an experimental stage and were not approved as a statistical standard. But there is a lot of work internationally going on, and including our own pilot research work on valuing ecosystem services in a variety of contexts that I think is really interesting work, and is sort of at the frontier in many ways. So ideally, as more countries are doing or experimenting with these accounts, that maybe in the next phase of the manuals, that we may have more consensus around those, and maybe it will be a statistical standard within the next decade, but that depends on how the work progresses.
The other thing I would add, all great points, Scott, is that we certainly have a great opportunity to positively impact that process with the work that's happening here in the US. It's going to be very necessary for the economists across the government to come together to figure out what those standards can and should be for the United States. And we've got lots of data here. We've got lots of expertise. And so I think we can really move the ball here in the US and help out the international community. So some of the lessons learned here can help to move us toward an eventual standard for valuation, but there will be work needed, and I think convening experts on valuation to figure out how to do that for the US is probably going to be something that'll need to happen in the next few years.
And it will be especially helpful in the next round of revisions to the next manual if the United States is already developing these at least research on these products, or maybe even going into production on some of these accounts, that when we are at the table and we're actually producing accounts, I think that carries more weight than if we are on the sidelines and are just sort of saying, well, in theory, this makes sense, and which, hey, I'm part of the folks that comment on these things, and I can tell them the theory, but when the United States actually does it, I think we'll have even more weight attached to our words if we can show them what we've done, and that's an exciting place to be, I think.
Thank you both. Our next question. What would be the elevator speech you would use to explain to political leaders and non-economists why it is important to continue investing in developing natural capital accounts?
I guess I could go first, Ken. Maybe you have this, but I think what Eli had mentioned earlier And what Ken mentioned with the quote that he had up there was perfect, is that our standard economic accounts and measurements that people are aware of are incomplete. And one of the big gaps in that is environmental assets. And to the extent that we're not accounting for something, our economic progress may be an incomplete picture of what's going on more broadly. So my elevator speech is that this is essential information to guide policymaking, particularly at the sort of macro level where we have aggregate statistics. It may be fine that, at some local level, you have local environmental impact studies and different things like that. Maybe we understand a lot of aspects about the local environments much better because of that. But not having macro statistics that correspond to our macro environmental economic statistics correspond to our other macroeconomic statistics leaves a big gap and may potentially lead us astray when deciding policies. So economists always say, if people are shielded from their costs in terms of creating externalities, you're going to have too much of some bad behavior. Or if they're shielded from the benefits, you won't have, in the case of positive externalities, you're going to have too little of those. And so by aligning and keeping all the costs and benefits, putting them all on the table, I think you can have more informed policy decisions across a range of potential policies, particularly at the federal level.
Yeah, I'll just add that I mean, certainly the pitch depends on the audience, like anything, but a common one that I would use is that we're living in an age where we need to be able to understand and make smart trade-offs, and we need information to do this. In the world of water, we're out of the era of big dam building, and in the Western US, we need to be able to respond very quickly to drought conditions, to various emergencies. This certainly would go for any type of natural hazards and hazard response, and understanding how green infrastructure investments can shield us from the effects of natural hazards and climate change. But we need this type of information, and we can't wait years on research products to deliver it. So when we have consistent national data to support informed decision making that needs to happen quickly, natural capital accounts can help fill that important need.
Thank you both. Next question. Is the marine natural capital a component of the blue economy, or are these separate things?
If that's at me, I will. I'll sort of punt that. I haven't been deeply involved in the marine economy accounts. I know that there's a tremendous amount of overlap, but exactly articulating the difference between sort of the blue economy and the marine economy, I'm not the best person. There might actually be somebody on this call much better to articulate that. Maybe even Monica would be as well. But
yeah, I'm happy to turn that to Monica or Jeff, who's been deeply involved in those processes.
Yeah.
And maybe even to share your vision for, for what comes next, because I know you've been thinking a lot about this.
Go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the blue economy, there are so many concepts of blue economy, but if you think about the blue economy being looking at the sustainable use of the resources and understanding, the impacts on ecosystem from the uses we have on those resources. The marine economy satellite account is just part of it. It doesn't, as I said in the beginning, it doesn't really include enough information about the resources and the dependencies of the economic activities to those resources for us to really understand, have a full comprehension of how we could move to a blue economy, have a sustainable use of the oceans and the coastal areas. So that's why we decided to get involved with this new initiative of OSTP. And we have been working with Ken and Scott for some time. And we do have plans to start looking into it and maybe, in short or medium term, have some ways of measuring the blue economy. And for the NOAA folks that, and Ken and Scott, this has been extremely helpful, extremely informative. But I just want to say for the NOAA folks that are interested or think they can contribute to the NOAA efforts that can show today on the OSTP list of potential pilots for NOAA, to contact us. You can just send me an email or contact Jeff Wielgus, because we are trying to get a small team in NOAA to have a better understand how we can work together and make sure we gather the information. See, NOAA has so much information that I'm sure we can leverage a lot of this information to start building those accounts and help us better understand the blue economy. I hope I answered the question. Don't know, Ken, Scott.
There's one other point I'll make, Monica. Thanks so much. And thanks for your leadership as well in helping push NOAA forward with this. It's been wonderful to have you, Jeff, and the rest of your colleagues participating in this. I think there's interesting parallels I'd mentioned earlier with Department of the Interior, being one of the major land management agencies in the U.S. and NOAA having that role for coastal and ocean resources. So, I think there are lessons learned. I think about how at Department of the Interior, back in 2011, I think, was the first year that we produced Department of the Interior economic contributions reports. That's not a satellite account or a formal account of any kind, but there was a desire to better understand what value is generated by Department of Interior lands and waters. And that over time has expanded, and there's always been a push to get better at doing non-market values. So I think there's a parallel there with NOAA that, marine economy satellite account is measuring those economic contributions, which are substantial and very important. But we can make that even more comprehensive and even more valuable for a wider cross-section of stakeholders as we are able to expand the scope of that.
Ken.
Great, thank you so much, Monica, Ken, Scott. This is a little bit of a segue, and I think it relates to making information a little more comprehensive. Has there been good progress in developing AI tools that can help in the development of accounts?
Well, I can speak to this a bit because this is sort of my other passion and area of interest professionally outside of accounting. First of all, you won't get far in AI without mentioning machine learning, and it's had such a revolution, especially over the last 5 to 8 years, that we see machine learning in everything. From modeling to classification, clustering, understanding relationships between data and discovering patterns that are enabled by big data. So, and NOAA is a leader here on the federal government as well. NOAA has a very active group working on AI, which is mostly focused on machine learning. So there's a variety of problems that machine learning can tackle in accounting related to modeling and understanding how nature contribute and ecosystems contribute to the economy. The flip side of that coin is that there's more to AI than just machine learning, and a passion of mine for 15 years now has been working on using technology called machine reasoning and semantics, where we have systems that are intelligent systems that are able to make choices about how to assemble data and models needed for accounts. And as we get more and more data, more and more models, they grow beyond the ability of a single user to understand and use them. So I can envision a future where our data and models are interoperable, and we use AI systems to help guide the assembly of data and models that could inform accounting. And as one example of that, we have a project called Aries for SIA, which we actually gave a demo of a year ago to this same NOAA library seminar. And we've been working on that with a number of countries to help make data and models interoperable and to use AI to support natural capital accounting. That said, that's a challenging road in the US because we have so much data and so many models, and the effort to make them interoperable and to use AI systems to help with that process is not going to be a quick or easy one, but it's a necessary one, I think, to navigate the data and model landscape and to do it efficiently, and ultimately to make this easier and faster, and I think to save money in the long run as well. So there's a big role for AI, I think, across the accounts, that across a different variety of technologies in AI as well.
I'll just add real quick that a plug that even though the pilot paper that valued land that I was discussing earlier, it does not use a machine learning method. I have a sequel paper, follow-up paper to that with a couple of other co-authors that uses a machine learning approach in our land valuation model that leverages the same data set, and we compare both a relatively simple approach that was put forward by our counterparts in the UK for their land valuation method, as well as the one that we did in the pilot account versus a new machine learning method. And we run some various comparisons and auto sample comparisons and so forth, and we find that that it has a large improvement in accuracy. So I think there's tremendous potential, at least on the valuation side, to use all of that data that Ken was talking about in a variety of different contexts, but certainly in some of these more difficult to value assets, like like land or a number of these other environmental assets, using these tools can be incredibly helpful. So.
Thanks, Scott. Let's stick with you. Does the outdoor recreational satellite account envision showing links to ecosystem recreational services?
That's a good question. We don't have current plans for that, but I can easily see a tie there. At least that, to my knowledge, I don't know if we have that in the cards, but that does seem like a natural tie to break that out further. That's a good idea.
I will quickly add to that. I haven't been involved directly in that effort either, but it's been led in part by some of my colleagues at the Department of the Interior's Office of Policy Analysis, and they do have a sort of a second generation set of recreation modeling and valuation that's kicking off. So going beyond the first outdoor recreation satellite account. So I think that sort of thing is on the table, but I don't think there's a set path quite yet.
And I could also see other connections to the marine economy satellite accounts as well in the years ahead. Not only as there are sort of plans to expand those, as I understand it, but even as these other asset accounts and so forth are developed further, we could have sub accounts that sort of expand into that. So I'm thinking one example is mineral and energy resources, for example, where we have subsoil or sub underwater assets for natural petroleum assets and so forth that could be tracked separately, and also resources related to resources related to the marine economy. So to the extent we already have aspects of that, but like to have some consistency with the accounts we develop in the future, I think that could be great for users of the accounts.
Thanks, Ken and Scott. Another question here. They're interested, the asker is interested more broadly in what percentage of the current valuation in the monetary ecosystem service accounts shown are simulated exchange values versus actual exchange values.
I don't know of any simulated exchange value studies in the U.S. The method I'm familiar with has mostly been piloted in Spain, and not used in any of the pilot accounts to date. Scott, do you know more about SEV and potential applications? I'm just speaking about the two applications that I demonstrated there earlier.
Yeah, I think these are more common in the academic literature, and when they were introduced in the manuals for ecosystem services, that was one among a number of other ones that were criticized because of that the exchange values, even though it sounds very similar to the exchange values that we're measuring in the national accounts, there were some definitional issues that that people had problems with, that were one of the reasons why it was not accepted as an international standard, given that that may not exactly line up with other valuation approaches that we use in the national accounts. I have not personally done a study using simulated exchange values, so I'm not an expert at all. But from my understanding of the boundary of the valuation did not necessarily align.
Thanks, Scott. I am not seeing any other questions yet, and we do have a little bit more time, but I did want to ask, would you mind if people reached out to you individually? If so, would you like me to share your emails in the chat?
Please, yes, definitely. We want to sort of get out there, and if to the extent that people have may find either instances where their work could fit in with what we do, could be either helpful for what we do, is joining us on sort of the supply side of this, or as Ken mentioned, if you have ideas for the demand side of this, if you think some work that we would be doing would be useful for you or your agency's work, we also want to know about that as well. So definitely contact us directly.
Great, just so everyone can see that, it should be in your chat. I put in both Ken and Scott's email, but I also linked in there Scott's full paper and Ken's paper that they had mentioned. There was lots of literature you guys were shouting out, and I did not catch them all. So I hope if anyone has questions about that, they will reach out to you about it. And we've given some people time. I don't see any questions, so I will ask one last question. Is there something you didn't share that you would like to? Your last shout out here.
Well, I'll just harken back to I think we're all enthusiastic about the potential of these accounts in the years ahead, and harken back, as Eli said, to the historical analog that the original economic accounts were developed in the Great Depression and World War II, and they solved some important problems, and they led to some really I think foundational changes in how we manage national economies in the 20th century. And I think these environmental economic statistics and natural capital accounts have the potential to do the same critical 21st century problems. So I hope you'll join us in that journey. That's pretty much my parting word.
Yeah, my parting words is just that we still are in the early stages of this, even though there's been a lot of work done in the last several years, various research projects and so forth, and we have an incredible number of experts in a lot of different areas. But I learn more and more each day about either potential applications of these accounts or potential new ways in which these accounts can be done, either from people that interactions I've had with counterparts internationally and what they're doing overseas, or new projects that other agencies are involved in. So I'm very humble and willing and open to learning more about what other agencies are currently doing or would like to be doing, and to the extent that as these projects and as these accounts would potentially develop in the next decade or so, I'm excited to learn what that looks like, and to the extent to which we can have cooperation across agencies that we may not be able to currently envision the full extent of that. It's just very exciting for that in the U.S. at least.
Thank you again so much, Ken and Scott. I will throw it to Monica to see if she has any last questions or comments.
No, I'm good. Thank you so much. I just want to thank Ken and Scott for coming to talk with NOAA today, and also our collaboration. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Jeff Wielgus, for organizing this workshop.
Yes, thank you all. Fantastic presentation, great question. We did record this, so you will be able to find it on the library's YouTube channel after the fact. And I hope everyone has a safe and healthy rest of their Wednesday. Take care, everyone, and thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks again. Take care.